So the Republicans, you said it right there, the Republicans are dedicated to bringing some end to slavery to an end in some way, but Civil War conversations in popular culture and even in scholarship have often focused on the fact that, or on evidence that shows that white Northerners had racist points of view. Abraham Lincoln made all sorts of official and unofficial moves to protect slavery. And therefore, can we question the Republican Party's and Lincoln and the Republican Party's dedication to overthrowing slavery? Or is the dedication solid and this other stuff is tangential?
Well, you're right. That's one of the most interesting questions asked regularly, and it should be asked because it's a knotty question. Mm-hmm. And it needs, therefore, to be said right up front that it's perfectly possible in that era to be a stone racist and to be opposed to slavery at the same time. Mm-hmm. To think black and white are not equal, but that slavery, for one reason or another, is an institution that ought not to exist in the country. Some people believed that black and white were unequal in capabilities, but believed that nonetheless enslaving a black person was simply immoral. Larger numbers believed that whether moral or immoral, it was bad for the country, for economic reasons and political reasons. And there's no question, it seems to me, that the Republican Party, whatever its various members thought about black people and their capabilities, was created precisely to oppose specifically slavery's further expansion. But they also believed that if they could prevent slavery from expanding further, that fact alone could ultimately choke slavery to death in the states where it already existed, states in which they believed the federal government had no power to intervene directly to uproot slavery.
And so that's something that the Southern slaveholders understood just as well as the Northern Republicans.
Oh, yes.
That the die was cast if slavery could not expand.
Oh, yes. The idea that this system had to expand in order to survive was widespread throughout both the North and the South, which is why when Lincoln says numerous times in the late 1850s that we intend to place this institution in the way of ultimate extinction, he's speaking for the Republican Party as a whole. The slave-owning population is very well aware of what's at stake, therefore. And this statement of Lincoln's becomes part of the 1860 campaign literature that the Republican Party is issuing. So this is not a secret.
Yeah. I guess one more step toward the literature, because it sort of brings us around here. One of the finest resources that scholars have used and that you use very well is Frederick Law Olmsted in the travel literature that was very popular in the antebellum, especially travel literature that looked at slavery. And so Olmsted, you might briefly tell us who it is, but Olmsted has enormous effect on Northern opinions about slavery coming up to the Civil War. Did he have a similar effect? Did this kind of writing have a similar effect on Southern white opinions of slavery and how they were being perceived?
Well, Olmsted, a landscape architect, right, central to the designing of Central Park in New York City, for example, was opposed to slavery and took, as you note, a series of tours through the South, different parts of the South, during which he spoke with different kinds of people in the South, and then reported what he found in his various widely circulated accounts in the North. So again, as you say, he did have an effect on Northern opinion. It's important to say that substantial portion of the Northern population, prior to reading things like that, or Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, frequently had a positive or neutral view of the war. The Northern Democratic Party, linked to the Democratic Party in the South, has a stake in assuring Northerners that really slavery is a very mild, benign institution. Slaves are happy being slaves. and that there's nothing to object to in that. So books like this are very important in beginning to challenge those preconceptions that have become in the North so widespread. Southerners, when they read any of these anti-slavery literature, pieces of literature, by and large, it's always dangerous to generalize, right? But by and large, Southerners, and especially those, of course, who are most supportive of slavery, dismiss them. Dismiss these works as distortions, self-serving testimonies on the part of opponents of slavery. And so there is a war of words going on throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in works of literature and works of fiction and nonfiction. For the loyalties of the North, they make relatively little dent, so far as I am aware, on widespread white opinion in the South.
Okay. But so the election brings us to the war, and one thing that we like to do with our program is show you artifacts that are here that we have here at the shop. They're for sale. Let us know if you're interested in anything that you see here. Although we're not going to quite go QVC on the folks at home, but we are going to bring out some artifacts. And I think now that we've gotten to the point in our discussion, I think we're going to start discussing how the House of Dixie decides to create its own house and take the Union apart. Here is the Charleston Mercury Extra, the broadside. It's a famous broadside. It was prominently displayed in the Ken Burns Civil War movie, and other people have seen it. This is the announcement. This is the broadside announcement that you would have seen posted on a wall in Charleston saying that it's over. December 20th, 1860, the Union is dissolved. What does this say about the attitudes of Southerners and as Confederate Southerners as they have taken this move in the wake of the election to secede and create a new nation?
Well, it's an exultation. It's a statement of exultation, particularly on the part of the Charleston Mercury, which had been calling for secession for many years prior to its actual occurrence. And it's no accident that it's South Carolina that takes the first step in beginning to pull the Union apart, because South Carolinian slave owners had been in the vanguard of the attempt to safeguard slavery against anything that they deemed to be threatening to it since at least the 1830s and the nullification crisis. And that in turn can be traced to the fact that South Carolina contained some of the largest plantations in the South, some of the largest concentrations of slaves. It's one of only 2 states in the South in which the black population actually outnumbers the white population in 1860. So South Carolina slave owners are among the most, if not the most, sensitive to any threat of on the part of anti-slavery figures against what Southerners called their peculiar institution. But what happens in 1860-61 differs from what had happened in the 1830s in that this time, as opposed to last time, the rest of the cotton states follow South Carolina's lead. And when secession is declared in South Carolina, pro-secession forces throughout the lower South, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, cheer and look forward to the day, which turns out to be not very far away, that their own legislatures or their own special conventions will follow suit.
There seems to be, when you read that, there seems to be a sense of relief and
Absolutely.
a sense of conclusion in this broadside, in this document. It's not the beginning of the Civil War at that time. It's the ending of, it's their ending, their decisive ending of all of this 80-some years of controversy
Within the Union.
within the Union.
Right.
It's the end of that.
Right.
It's not the beginning of the Civil War.
Indeed. Large numbers of people in the South, as in the North, convinced themselves in 1861 that if there's any war going to happen at all, and more than a few are sure that there will be none such. But if anything that deserves the name of a war even breaks out, it will be brought to a conclusion quickly. Now, of course, the Northerners believe that they'll be the ones who will emerge victorious quickly, and the Southerners, who have by and large convinced themselves that any individual Southern can handle any 5 to 10 Yankees with one arm tied behind his back, are equally sure that this is going to be a small skirmish rather than a major conflict.
So, and that brings them to not being able to see what the war is going to be like. We have a question from someone that wrote in who's watching. Thank you very much. And this is a good question. It may not be within the covers of the book, but it's a great question about labor and the South and slavery as a system of labor. Okay, Doug in Richmond, Kentucky writes, why didn't the freeing of Southern slaves lead to a corresponding improvement in the treatment of quote-unquote wage slaves in Northern industry?
It's a good question. The freeing of Southern slaves done by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, at least that's the instrument that finally does away with slavery as a legal entity throughout the United States, has no parallel in legislation that addresses what your viewer calls wage slavery, since that is a critical name given to the process, of course, in which a person who is legally free sells his or her ability to labor on a free open market to a potential employer who, in many cases at least, bargains with that legally free individual over the level of wages. It's called wage slavery by people who feel that this is still a form of implicit bondage because the wage earner has no choice but to go to work for someone like that, or starve, or be put out in the street for inability to pay for housing.
But there are very few people, I think, in 1861 that draw a conclusion, that draw a parallel between slavery and free labor, because maybe they still think that, maybe they don't see the coercion in the capital.
Exactly right. I mean, the form of coercion involved in slavery is palpable, physical, and draws blood, literally draws blood in the form of the whip, if in no other form. It's much more subtle in the case of the wage earner, who's being coerced by the need to survive, which can only be satisfied by obtaining a wage. So there would have had to be an amendment to the Constitution in order to fundamentally affect wage earning of a revolutionary nature unheard of in the middle of the 19th century.
Okay.
And by the way, just let me add, many Southern defenders of chattel slavery insisted that what your viewer calls wage slavery is very little different from chattel slavery. And that those who attempt to draw a sharp contrast between the two are misleading the audience.
Right.
It's Northerners who draw the sharp distinction between a wage labor population and a slave labor population.
And they do see a sharp distinction. Of course, Karl Marx is writing in 1860, but he's probably not very well widely read, and his ideas,
to say the least,
political economy, they're not part of the conversation. But there is this basic fight over what fairness is.
That's
and
right.
There are some Northerners saying, hey, what we do is an agreement, whether there's implicit coercion, and what you do is slavery.
That's right. That's right. You don't have to be Karl Marx or a Marxist living in the North to be critical of conditions in which many people in the North live. And indeed, there are some writers in the 1830s in the North who say things about conditions of the Northern poor that seem almost to anticipate what Marx is eventually going to say.